Hi there. So, I'll be talking about trauma. Trauma. So, first, I'm going to talk about what it means. Trauma. So, trauma is an emotional reaction to a terrible life event. Now, usually, that terrible life event has the capacity of turning the course of one's life, and in this case it's the one who experiences it or who has experienced it, turning their lives, the course of their lives, and perhaps directing it in a negative way, impacting their lives in a negative way. And there are a couple of events that could happen in an individual's life where they could pick trauma from. Generally, loss. It could be loss of a loved one that they formed attachments with over time. It could be the loss of a spouse. It could be the loss of a parent. It could be the loss of a child. It could be the loss of perhaps even a job. Now, it could be some natural disaster that has happened, perhaps flooding. It could be perhaps an earthquake that may have devastated their lives and wrecked their home. So trauma could result from that. It could be rape. It could be robbery. An individual involved in a robbery incident. It could be from childhood. It could be negligence, from parental negligence, a child's emotional needs neglected, or the child's personality invalidated. So negative words directed toward the child when they're still at that very tender developmental stage could impact their lives negatively later on in their lives. It could make them have a negative self-image. It could make them have problems with self-esteem, and it could generally affect their relationships with other people. So trauma has symptoms, right? I could call it signs, and one of them is violent flashbacks. So when the negative, terrible event happens, the individual forms memory of it because of the hippocampus, which is a brain region responsible for forming emotional memories. So the person forms emotional memories about that event, and it's a terrible negative event. So it draws negative emotional memories, and on occasion the person's mind goes back to that occasion or to that event where, for instance, they were robbed, or where, for instance, they lost a family relation that they were quite very close to. They had this very solid connection and bond with. So that is explaining violent flashbacks. Next, I'm going to talk about avoidance. So an individual who has experienced a traumatic event would generally avoid such scenarios, such occasions that would put them exactly in how do I say it now? That would make them experience such a thing again, because our brains are actually not wired to withstand negativity a lot. That's not how we are programmed. Okay, so the brain works better with excitement and positive excitement. That's what I mean. Happiness and the brain's reward system, dopaminergic energy, and endorphins. So when it's negative, the entire body is affected negatively. So the individual avoids. A lady who was raped at a particular place, for instance, she was walking down the road in the night on a lonely road. She's going to generally avoid doing that because that's how we learn. Something that has happened to us that is negative, we're going to avoid such events that in the first instance made it happen to us. But if it's a good thing, and trauma doesn't happen from good or positive events, if it's a good thing, we crave or we seek some sort of re-experiencing of that kind of thing. Now, I'm going to talk about another sign, which is nightmares. So the person who has experienced trauma may have problems with sleep. So when they sleep, they find sometimes they see fire, they see people chasing them, and they just spring up from the bed and they are agitated, and by that perhaps they are sweating. Sometimes they could become hysterical. They may be shouting, they may be crying, they may be wailing. So that's the experience of nightmares. And then insomnia, which is another sign. Now, insomnia is the inability to fall or stay asleep. So someone who is experiencing insomnia, when they fall asleep, they don't sleep long before they wake up. And when they wake up, they'll tell you that the sleep was not refreshing and the sleep was not adequate. Okay, so there are many other reasons why an individual could experience insomnia. But for an individual that has experienced trauma, their insomnia is induced from or by the traumatic incident that they've experienced. Now, in the world generally, there are people who have been displaced as a result of crises. There is crisis between Russia and Ukraine. It started 2022, if I recall correctly, on the 22nd day of February. The current president of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump, is trying to resolve that conflict. Now, only a while ago, there was a conflict between Israel and Iran. And in Nigeria, there are crises too, and people have been displaced. People have been orphaned. People have become widows. They've lost their husbands. People have become widowers. Men have lost their wives. So these kind of people are prone to insomnia because of that kind of loss. So the symptoms of trauma, again, there is avoidance, there is violent flashbacks, there is insomnia. Alright? And insomnia, I explained that the individual is unable to fall or stay asleep. When they fall asleep, they wake up soon after they fall asleep and they report that the sleep is inadequate and it's not refreshing, and they experience early morning awakening. They wake up in the early hours of the day when it's still dark, alright, and they're just up, agitated. And I also talked about nightmares. So an individual who has experienced trauma, it becomes very important for them to go for trauma healing, to see a therapist, to see a clinical psychologist, to see a psychiatrist, okay? And when they see them, there is going to be diagnostic interviewing, there is going to be an assessment, and perhaps the skilled professional will use their skill set to help the individual. Perhaps they could use a couple of theories, and perhaps they would use an eclectic model using more than one theory to help the individual. So it's very, very, very important because trauma affects the brain and it affects the body. So if you know someone who has been traumatized, or if you yourself is traumatized, please see a specialist. Thank you very much for your time. Bye now.